Relatives and friends stunned by a violent crime in Calaveras County. Investigators say a father killed his two teenage sons before turning the gun on himself.
Investigators also believe their own father, Philip Marshall, shot them, the family dog, then turned the gun on himself.
Philip Marshall was an author, but he was also a commercial airline pilot. After 9/11, he looked at that whole situation and he decided it could not have happened the way the government said it happened.
He had said to his friends, his private, very close friends, that he was worried that his family would be targeted by government agents.
The real question is was this actually a murder-suicide, as the police say, or was it some kind of assassination, possibly a national security assassination?
Relatives and friends stunned by a violent crime in Calaveras County. Investigators say a father killed his two teenage sons before turning the gun on himself.
Investigators believe their own father, Philip Marshall, shot them, the family dog, then turned the gun on himself.
A shocking event that devastated a family and a community, leaving many questions to those who knew Philip Marshall. It's a tragic tale that gives rise to questions about what really happened.
Philip Marshall was an author, but he was also a commercial airline pilot. He flew contract missions for the Central Intelligence Agency, and this was in the early 80s, and he was involved in the what was called the Iran-Contra scandal. He, for example, flew one of the principals in that whole episode, a guy named Barry Seal. After Barry Seal lost his own license to fly, Phil Marshall would fly him on missions for the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Central Intelligence Agency. Barry Seal was assassinated in a gangland-style hit in 1986 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, right before he was going to testify about other people involved in Iran-Contra.
Philip Marshall was, he had retired, he was a retired airline pilot with this long CIA-related, crime-related history, and he was living in retirement in Calaveras County, California. Now, Philip Marshall has a very, very checkered history. He was smuggling cocaine with Barry Seal for the CIA. He piloted Barry Seal, the world's most notorious CIA drug smuggler, around in a private aircraft, and he was tied in with this group of, I think it's a group of 40, this CIA drug smuggling criminal network.
After he did the work for the CIA, where he flew to CIA bases in Central America, he went to work for Eastern Airlines, and then he went to fly for United Airlines. He retired in the 1990s.
Although Philip Marshall was a retired pilot, his interests in aviation and how the FAA conducts business remained intact.
Philip Marshall was excited about his work, he was enthusiastic about it, passionate, and he had a lot to say and a lot to contribute. He had very strong family ties. He was a devoted father, had a stable marriage.
His first book he wrote was called Lakefront Airport, and it was a novel based on his experiences flying people like Barry Seal around, flying in and out of Lakefront Airport, which he was very familiar with.
Confirmed reports this morning.
Difficult moment for America. Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
After 9/11, he looked at that whole situation and he decided it could not have happened the way the government said it happened. And he wrote two nonfiction books. The last one called The Big Bamboozle, about how basically this scenario that was explained by the 9/11 Commission could have never taken place, that he as a pilot and he did fly some of the planes that went into the World Trade Center. So he flew the 767, 757. So he was very familiar with these two aircraft, and he just looked at this as a pilot.
His time as a pilot and the author of 2 previous books raised speculation that Philip Marshall might have discovered new information on 9/11 that encouraged him to start writing a 3rd book.
If you look at the first book, he maintained that the aircraft were piloted by the alleged hijackers, Mohammed Atta and the others. His 3rd book, he may have been veering away from that theory, and the reason why is I attended Phil Marshall's memorial, and one of the things I found out from a family member was, my question was, can you tell me what he was looking at? What was the 3rd book about? And the individual who told me actually works in government law enforcement, relative. And this individual told me, you want to look where my relative was looking. You want to look at the Marana. Actually, you want to look at Marana, Arizona. Marana, Arizona is the location of the Pinal Air Park. Pinal Air Park hosts Evergreen Aviation. Evergreen Aviation is a well-known CIA front activity. I think his books were like a series. As he would find out more and more information, obviously some people were reading his books, and he was being contacted by a lot of people who knew information. And every time he got more and more information, it seems like he would publish a new book. So he was working on yet a 3rd book about 9/11. And we don't know what that book was going to be about. However, for one thing, his computer is still missing. It was the police confiscated his computer, and the last I heard, it was in the Department of Justice Technical Laboratory in Sacramento. He looked at this as a pilot and just, again, questioned how the planes could have been commandeered and how the military failed to respond according to their own regulations and operational orders. And so it was basically the big bamboozle was what the American people were told. They were lied to. The questions that Phil Marshall raised were, for example, how could the entire North American air defense structure and the Federal Aviation Administration managed to collapse in a period of, just less than an hour, really, on 9/11, even less than that, less time than that. So he looked at that and said, how could this have happened unless there was some sort of collusion at the top? And his questions were questions asked by many others, but very few people who asked those questions had the kind of background that Phil Marshall had.
Philip Marshall was in disbelief that the FAA would allow such a large miscommunication to happen on 9/11. He was trying to make sense of the events from an Air Force perspective. He was trying to figure out how the military and the FAA could falter on their own procedures.
Philip Marshall's version of 9/11 is a little different from mine. Philip Marshall's version is something along the lines of what we call a LIHOP version, let it happen on purpose. That is, Philip Marshall accepts that there was a sort of radical Muslim Arab plot to attack the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and that the role of the US authorities was just to get out of the way and let it happen. That is, let it happen on purpose. And I, of course, am more with the MIHOP camp, the made it happen on purpose camp. That is, we believe that there was no such radical Arab Muslim plot, that to the extent that there was, that it was actually part of a national security false flag operation. I think that Marshall's version is perhaps a little easier to swallow for people who accept the standard picture of events in the media. It's hard for a lot of people to understand that their government is not really very democratic, that it's bought and paid for by these powerful financial forces behind the scenes, and that those financial forces are really what orchestrate these things. And it's hard for people to accept also, I think, that the millions of people killed in these wars after 9/11 have been killed for such a complete lie. Philip Marshall's book accepts the idea of these radical Muslim hijackers, ties them into the Saudi government, and then says that the US government just got out of the way and let it happen. And no, I don't accept that.
Despite all the debate, many argue that 9/11 Commission released a solid report on the incident and it should not be contested. They write off other theories that deviate from this report as a conspiracy theory.
Phil Marshall, like many people who have written about 9/11, you either have to go to self-publishers or subsidized publishers or just-in-time publishers, because the big publishing houses, most of which are in New York, don't want to touch this story. They're more apt to publish books that substantiate and support the 9/11 Commission findings, maybe with a few disagreements, but not to suggest in any way, shape, or form that the U.S. government had any advanced knowledge of 9/11. That just doesn't usually make it through the process.
The mainstream world will not allow for any story besides the official story to be taken as the truth for 9/11. So how did those who dig too deep, trying to make sense of this tragic event, fit into society? The way the media portrayed the official story of Philip Marshall's domestic murder-suicide raised a lot of questions to those who were familiar with his work. As an investigative journalist, Wayne Madison looks into it.
Immediately when I got to Calaveras County, I actually walked around his house and looked in the windows. And this is probably about a week or so after his death, week and a half maybe. And first thing I noticed were a bunch of empty banker's boxes at his front door. The house had been basically cleaned out. The banker boxes were interesting because either they were left over from hauling some files out, or they were brought there and they said, well, we've got all our files, we'll leave these there. Or there were files in those boxes that had been removed. The computer had been ripped out of the wall, so the wires were still there, but it had been, you could see where it had been yanked from the cable. He allegedly killed himself and his children on the evening of January 31st. His children did not show up for school the next day, which was a Friday. It was a school day. Their friends got a little concerned because, kids their age, they were teenagers after all. Saturday morning, and that was February the 2nd, the children came to the house. The door was open, unlocked. Phil Marshall had always told friends that with what he was writing, he had to be careful for personal safety. He always locked his door. The neighbor walked in, saw Phil Marshall lying on the floor on his back with a bullet hole which had bled profusely on the left side of his head. And this is very interesting because Phil Marshall was right-handed. The gun was lying underneath Phil's body. His son and his daughter were found shot on like a sofa, which was a U-shaped sofa, and they would, one was on one long part of the U, and opposite on the other part was the other child. The pet dog, which was a Shih Tzu, which was a little white yappy dog, was found dead, shot to death in the bedroom. Now, a lot of people wondered, even say you were going to kill yourself and your kids, why the dog?
On the other hand, Sergeant Chris Hewitt commented on the police investigation, stating, "All evidence and information at the scene confirmed that it was indeed a double murder-suicide, and there was no evidence to suggest that there was an outside party who entered the house and committed a triple murder. The sheriff's department made the same conclusion.
The question of whether Philip Marshall's death is a conspiracy theory or not is really kind of the wrong terminology. The real question is was this actually a murder-suicide, as the police say, or was it some kind of assassination, possibly a national security assassination? Given that background, and then given that Philip Marshall wrote a book arguing that 9/11 was a false flag operation, it certainly makes you wonder whether he may have been killed to try to cover something up, to prevent information that he had from coming to light, or something of that nature.
The thing to understand is that in a murder-suicide, usually, in all cases, in a true murder-suicide, a husband is leaving his wife and wants to destroy the children and destroy any evidence of their marriage. Philip Marshall had a very strong marriage, and he had said to his friends, his private, very close friends, and also to some members of the 9/11 community, that he was worried that his family would be targeted by government agents and might face repercussions for his own activism and his outspoken opposition and challenging the official story on 9/11. So he had spoken about his fear for his family at this time. Usually in a murder-suicide where the dog is also killed, it's because there's a single parent who feels the children and family pet will have no one to care for them after the adult is gone. So they kill the entire family in despair. There is nothing about Philip Marshall as a man that fits the profile of a murder-suicide. This is not something that anyone believes who knows him.
This brings about speculation on Philip Marshall's case possibly being an FBI cover-up. Was he in the midst of researching information that could have embarrassed the US government, or discovered something the federal government didn't want exposed? Philip Marshall raised concerns to his family members that he might be a target because of his work. Would his sudden death raise questions to his family members?
So a relative of Phil Marshall who works in federal law enforcement said, look, Phil was snooping around Marana, and I checked it out, and it's a location of Evergreen Aviation, which is a CIA proprietary airline. It has been a location for a lot of CIA operations, aviation operations, and it still is. And Special Forces, U.S. Special Forces train there. They do paratroop training and other special operations there. But Marana may not be familiar to many people, but anyone who's driven by Marana eventually can look out over a field, a huge airfield. However, when I realize what Marana is, there can be only one explanation why Phil Marshall was interested in Marana, and that reason is that, and if this was the subject of his next book, it would have been a blockbuster. It could have explained all the anomalies about 9/11, that the planes that hit the Trade Center were actually recommissioned civilian aircraft, 757s, 767s, from the Marana airfield, where they are stored. The only explanation is that Phil Marshall was tipped off by somebody on the inside. He had been contacted by some old veterans of the Iran-Contra affairs, Central Intelligence Agency people. So, the next book and what the government would have killed him for was that Phil Marshall had obtained some information that the aircraft used on 9/11 were not those regularly scheduled commercial planes, American and United.
People who doubt the official story of 9/11 suggest that Philip Marshall was murdered because of his 9/11 related novels. They believe Marshall was exposing certain information that was kept secret from the public.
I don't know whether Marshall was murdered I'm not even 100% certain that he was murdered at all. I mean, it's possible the police version could conceivably be true. Wayne Madsen, who I trust, says that he's 100% sure that the police version is wrong. But I haven't studied it enough to really know. But as far as likely motives for this being a professional hit, which is what I think it probably was, would include a lot of things other than 9/11. I don't think he was murdered just because he wrote a book on 9/11. A lot of us have written books on 9/11. There are many, many dozens. There are probably actually well over 100 pretty solid books discussing various aspects of the 9/11 inside job by now. And nobody has been running around murdering authors of 9/11 books. So no, I don't think that was the reason. It's more likely that he had some kind of information that someone didn't want made public. His computer apparently was taken after he was killed, and there were people cleaning his house. There were mysterious vans showing up with communications equipment doing unauthorized cleanings of his house, according to Wayne Madsen. So it sounds like somebody was after information that he had, and that could have involved anything. So he probably had some kind of information, and they probably killed him and took the information back.
I believe that Philip Marshall was killed by a private security firm. There is another death, very suspicious death, of Michael Hastings, who was a Rolling Stones journalist who wrote a devastating article on General McChrystal, who was running the battlefield front in Afghanistan, who was then fired. And Michael Hastings then turned his attention to General Petraeus and the use of surveillance on top leaders in the United States for purpose of blackmail. Michael Hastings was killed in the same community as in the greater Los Angeles area as Philip Marshall.
Did Philip Marshall go too far in his research of national security issues? If so, could there be similar cases out there?
Phil Marshall is not the only person who has had an interest in U.S. covert operations, 9/11, who has died suspiciously. He's one of many, unfortunately. And in every single one of these cases, proper police investigation techniques are overlooked. There's inadequate forensics. Why was the crime scene cleaned before the investigation was complete? What happened to Phil Marshall's computer? Who has it now? What information was on it? Who were the people who went to the premises after the professional cleaners showed up in the unmarked SUVs? What agencies did they represent? Were there federal government agents present? What is going on at Marana Airfield? What did Phil Marshall stumble across at Marana Airfield at Pinal Air Park that could have gotten him have a death sentence put on his head? Why the kids? These are things that anybody would ask.
Could 9/11 whistleblowers' lives be in danger?
The authorities in this country do not run around just killing anybody who does 9/11 truth work. They have other ways of dealing with us. They do character assassinations. They assassinate our reputations and keep us from making a living. They marginalize us. They have all kinds of strategies for harassing us, but thank goodness they, for the most part, don't kill us. So unless somebody hands me an envelope full of information that somebody really doesn't want me to put out, and that hasn't happened yet, I don't think that I'm likely to meet that fate. At least I hope not.
Well, I will tell you that, as you know, I was the second woman arrested on the Patriot Act, the second non-Arab American woman arrested on the Patriot Act. And there's a misconception in the United States that only foreigners are being targeted, and certainly mostly they are. However, what's happening increasingly is, especially with private security firms, are tasked to police the community with no judicial supervision at all. And they are taking it upon themselves to punish, to hand out punishments which are outside the policy barriers.
I think we need to pursue this case and pursue the truth in all cases like it, where it appears that somebody who had become a whistleblower, which Philip Marshall apparently had become towards the end of his life, is killed, and especially when family members are killed too, this is a bad enough crime that I think that we need to get at the truth. We owe that truth to Philip Marshall and to his family and to the country. And even if it were to turn out that it wasn't the federal authorities behind this, we need to know that. You know, it's just not right to be living in a country where the truth about these kinds of situations is just not available. If we don't have the truth, we can't have an informed populace, and we can't have anything remotely resembling democracy. So yeah, this is one of those cases where we need to tenaciously continue to pursue the truth.
We may never know what really happened to Philip Marshall and his family that day. Many believe the sheriff department's conclusion, but others are convinced a third party is responsible. In this story of a young and happy family's shattered tragedy, Philip Marshall's case leaves more questions than answers. Similar to the mysterious deaths of fellow authors J.H. Hatfield, Gary Webb, and Hunter S. Thompson.
Enforcement Administration and the Central Intelligence Agency. Barry Seal was assassinated in a gangland-style hit in 1986 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, right before he was going to testify about other people involved in Iran-Contra.
Philip Marshall was, he had retired, he was a retired airline pilot with this long CIA-related, crime-related history, and he was living in retirement in Calaveras County, California. Now, Philip Marshall has a very, very checkered history. He was smuggling cocaine with Barry Seal for the CIA. He piloted Barry Seal, the world's most notorious CIA drug smuggler, around in a private aircraft. And he was tied in with this group of, I think it's a group of 40, this CIA drug smuggling criminal network.
After he did the work for the CIA, where he flew to CIA bases in Central America. He went to work for Eastern Airlines, and then he went to fly for United Airlines. He retired in the 1990s.
Although Philip Marshall was a retired pilot, his interests in aviation and how the FAA conducts business remained intact.
Philip Marshall was excited about his work. He was enthusiastic about it, passionate. And he had a lot to say and a lot to contribute. He had very
Philip Marshall was an author, but he was also a commercial airline pilot. He flew contract missions for the Central Intelligence Agency. And this was in the early 80s, and he was involved in the what was called the Iran-Contra scandal. He, for example, flew one of the principals in that whole episode, a guy named Barry Seal. After Barry Seal lost his own license to fly, Phil Marshall would fly him on missions for the drug enforcement.
Relatives and friends stunned by a violent crime in Calaveras County. Investigators say a father killed his two teenage sons before turning the gun on himself.
Investigators believe their own father, Philip Marshall, shot them, the family dog, then turned the gun on himself.
Philip Marshall was an author, but he was also a commercial airline pilot. After 9/11, he looked at that whole situation and he decided it could not have happened the way the government said it happened.
He had said to his friends, his private, very close friends, that he was worried that his family would be targeted by government agents.
The real question is was this actually a murder-suicide, as the police say, or was it some kind of assassination, possibly a national security assassination?
Relatives and friends stunned by a violent crime in Calaveras County. Investigators say a father killed his two teenage sons before turning the gun on himself.
Investigators believe their own father, Philip Marshall, shot them, the family dog, then turned the gun on himself.
A shocking event that devastated a family and a community, leaving many questions to those who knew Philip Marshall. It's a tragic tale that gives rise to questions about what really happened.